Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking an absolute masterpiece of modern legal theory, H.L.A. Hart's Analytical School of Jurisprudence. If you've ever found yourself wondering what truly separates a binding law from, say, just a simple societal tradition, or how a legal system actually survives from one generation to the next, you are in exactly the right place. H.L.A. Hart was this brilliant mind who practiced law, worked in military intelligence, and later became a legendary professor at Oxford. And in 1961, he completely revolutionized how we understand legal systems with his book, The Concept of Law. He didn't just, tweak existing theories. He literally rebuilt our understanding of jurisprudence right from the ground up.
Okay, here's our syllabus for today. We'll start by deconstructing command theory, move into the micro level of habits versus rules, explore the internal psychology of law, scale up to primary and secondary rules, and finally evaluate academic criticisms of Hart's framework. Let's dive in. Section 1. Deconstructing command theory and the flaws of John Austin.
To really appreciate Hart's genius here, we first have to understand the dominant theory he was arguing against. For the longest time, John Austin's command theory completely dominated jurisprudence. This was basically the idea that law is simply a sovereign's command backed up by a threat. In Austin's view, the sovereign barks an order, and the subjects obey out of sheer habit because they're terrified of punishment. But Hart systematically dismantles this. He points out that, in modern democracies, lawmakers don't just sit high up above the law. They are bound by the exact same laws they create. Plus, not all laws are commands backed by threats. Think about the laws that allow you to create a will, get married, or form a valid contract. Those laws don't demand obedience or threaten you. They actually confer power. They give you the legal machinery to make your own choices a reality. Austin's theory just completely fails to account for these power-conferring rules. And that brings us to the really famous Rex I to Rex II succession problem. This brilliantly proves that a mere habit of obedience cannot explain how a legal system survives the transition of power. Imagine a sovereign, let's call him King Rex I. Over time, society develops a habit of obeying his commands. Simple enough, right? But what happens the day Rex I dies and his successor, Rex II, takes the throne? On day one, Rex II hasn't established any habit of obedience with the public yet. So according to Austin's strict logic, because there's no habit, Rex II's orders aren't actually laws, and the entire continuity of the legal system just breaks down. Hart points out that this is, frankly, absurd. A legal system survives a change in leadership because there is a continuous rule of succession, not just some temporary habit of doing what you're told.
Let's move on to Section 2, Social Habits versus Social Rules at the micro level.
Having totally dismantled Austin's top-down command theory, Hart decides to build his own theory from the bottom up, looking really closely at everyday human behavior. Let's test your intuition with a quick interactive mini-case. Imagine a society of 50 people. Every single evening, 40 of them have a routine of going for a walk in the local park. Now compare that to a totally different scenario. In this same society, people consistently take their shoes off before entering a temple. Both of these scenarios involve a general pattern of behavior that people repeat. But legally and socially, they are fundamentally different things. So why is that? The answer perfectly illustrates the difference between habit and a rule. You see, a mere habit carries absolutely no penalty if it's broken, but a social rule carries the heavy weight of societal judgment if you fail to comply. Think about it. If one of those 40 people decides to just stay home and binge a TV show instead of walking in the park, no one in the society is going to criticize them. It's just a social habit. But if someone walks into that temple wearing muddy sneakers, society will instantly view that action as faulty. They will face immediate criticism and social pressure. At that point, the behavior is no longer just a habit. It has become a normative standard. And this brings us right to Hart's precise definition of a social rule. It is a standard of common behavior where deviation is considered faulty, triggering social pressure to comply. It's exactly this social pressure, this insistent real-world demand from your community, that transforms a simple repeated action into a profound sense of obligation. You feel a duty to comply, not just because it's what everyone else is doing, but because it's the accepted standard of right and wrong within that specific group. All right, Section 3, the internal aspect and the psychology of rules. This realization leads directly to what is arguably Hart's most vital contribution, the psychological dimension of rules. He argued that Austin's command theory treated people like robots just reacting to threats, completely missing what Hart famously called the internal aspect of law. To grasp this internal aspect, imagine an external observer who knows absolutely nothing about chess, watching a game. From their external perspective, they just see little wooden pieces moving in regular patterns. They basically just see a social habit. But now, put yourself in the shoes of the players themselves, the internal perspective. The players aren't moving pieces out of habit. They understand that the rules dictate how those pieces absolutely must and ought to move. If a player slides a rook diagonally, their opponent is instantly going to say, "Hey, you can't do that, that's against the rules." The players are actively using the rules as a standard for their behavior.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that a legal system only functions when its members hold this critical reflective attitude. They internally accept the rules as a general standard of conduct. They use these rules to evaluate their own behavior and the behavior of the people around them. Going to the park on a Friday night is a habit, but it totally lacks this critical reflective attitude because no one thinks it's morally wrong to go on a Tuesday instead. Law and social rules absolutely require this internal buy-in to function properly.
Now, you might be wondering, how do we cross the bridge from a simple social rule to an actual binding law? Well, Hart explains that when a social rule is enforced merely by social pressure and criticism from the community, that gives us a moral obligation. However, when society organizes itself so that breaking the rule triggers physical sanctions and official penalties like fines or imprisonment handed down by authorities, that moral obligation hardens into a strict legal obligation. So the very nature of the rule changes based on exactly how the society reacts when it's violated. Moving right along to Section 4, primary and secondary rules at the macro level. Scaling things up to the structural level brings us to Hart's ultimate thesis, which stands as one of the most famous conclusions in all of analytical jurisprudence. He states that law is not just a bunch of sovereign commands, but rather it's a complex union of primary rules and secondary rules. Let's break down exactly what that means for a functioning legal system. Primary rules are the basic do's and don'ts of a society. They impose duties directly on citizens. Don't steal, don't commit violence, pay your taxes. But Hart argues that a primitive society relying only on primary rules suffers from three massive crippling defects. It is uncertain, it is static, and it is terribly inefficient. Think about it. If you only have a giant list of primary rules, how do you actually know which rules are valid? How do you change a rule that's totally outdated? And who gets to officially decide if a rule was broken? To cure these defects, society had to invent secondary rules. Secondary rules are basically rules about rules. They confer power, allowing officials to formally create, alter, and validate those primary rules. Secondary rules are also at the point at which society moves from primitive society to a society with a law system. Let's walk through this masterclass cheat sheet of secondary rules drawn straight from Hart's framework. First up, to cure the problem of uncertainty, we have the rule of recognition. This is the ultimate test that determines which primary rules are officially valid. Second, to cure a static, unchanging society, we have the rule of change. This gives legislatures the procedural power to alter existing laws or introduce brand new ones, like passing a new tax code. Third, to cure inefficiency in enforcement, we have the rule of adjudication. This empowers the judiciary, giving judges the actual authority to determine when a rule has been violated. And finally, we have sanction-imposing rules, which dictate the specific penalties authorities are allowed to use when a breach happens. Together, these four secondary rules act as the structural, living machinery behind every modern legal system. And finally, Section 5, evaluating the framework and its academic criticisms. Now, as we know, no philosophical framework is entirely bulletproof. Some legal scholars argue that taking the vast entirety of a complex legal system and squeezing it into merely duty-imposing primary rules and power-conferring secondary rules is a bit of an oversimplification. Take a void contract, for example. If a contract is legally void, it doesn't impose a duty, but it definitely doesn't confer a valid power either. It just sits awkwardly outside Hart's two categories. On top of that, critics point out that secondary rules don't just confer power. Sometimes they actually impose duties. Think about the rule of change. Yes, it gives the government the power to alter laws, but sometimes it imposes a strict duty on the government to hold a public referendum before they're allowed to do so. So the lines between power and duty are a lot blurrier than Hart might suggest. Which brings us to our final and honestly, perhaps most provocative paradox. Hart tells us that the rule of recognition is the ultimate benchmark used to validate every single primary rule in society. But if it validates everything else, what validates the rule of recognition itself? Is it just a social habit of the officials? And if so, doesn't that circle us right back to the very flaw Hart originally saw in Austin's theory? I am going to leave you with that fundamental question to spark your continued exploration of jurisprudence. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Hart's masterclass, and keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.